Greetings, friends. I've followed Auron MacIntyre for some years now. He's produced some pretty good content. And on X, I saw a post by Keith Woods. Keith Woods didn't have a very favorable view of Auron MacIntyre. He was commenting on Auron's appearance on Tucker Carlson's podcast, where they went on for, more than an hour and a half? They had a long sit-down interview, which touched on topics like American identity, managerialism, the direction the country's headed in, and of course, that involved a question of white racialism versus ethnic identity. And this is what Keith Woods had to say. Let's hear him out. I'll give my response, of course, and I will want to play a bit of the actual interview of Tucker Carlson and Auron MacIntyre so we can more deeply understand the context and what was actually said. But we will look at what Keith had to say, because that's what I saw first, and then I went and listened to the whole podcast with Tucker Carlson and Auron MacIntyre with this take of Keith's in my mind. So Keith Woods says, Auron MacIntyre's views on race are totally incoherent. Auron MacIntyre is a conservative opposed to white identity politics. Because his audience is more radical, he has to use pill pool to spread his message that white identity politics is evil. Now I had to look up what is pill pool. It turns out that it's a term particularly related to textual analysis of the Talmud, involving mental gymnastics to justify apparent contradictions or to derive conclusions through subtle means of analysis. Basically, intellectual trickery and dishonesty is what he's accusing Auron MacIntyre of, in saying that MacIntyre uses pill pool on the question of race. Going on, Keith Woods says that in this interview, Auron tells Tucker that thinking of people by race is a modern vulgarization. Not true, says Keith. He says that actually the modern innovation is the distinction between ethnicity and race that Auron insists on. Auron claims the real identities of Americans should be the hundreds of smaller ethnicities of the immigrants that arrived there. The Amish and Orthodox Jews are apparently good examples of what communities in America should look like. And again, that's not what Auron is saying, Keith, but we'll get to that. But then later in his interview, Auron says to be an American is to adopt an Anglo-Protestant culture, and any groups can be absorbed into this Anglo-Protestant culture. So Auron is at once decrying Sicilians and Swedes dropping their ethnic identity to enter a more generic white category, while also complaining that the system has stopped attempting to absorb new groups into the foundational identity. Of course, this is all stupid. What ethnic identity is Auron? The idea that the European groups that make up white America would keep their European identities through centuries without any ethnogenesis is ridiculous. Auron also scoffs at the naive idea that a country could be united simply by propositions and shared beliefs. Then, when asked what the Anglo-Protestant identity of heritage Americans is, he proceeds to list a bunch of beliefs like free speech and individualism, which I'd say is fair for Keith to point out. Interestingly, one of Auron's most recent guests on his channel was some Jew, so that doesn't matter. He concludes that Auron is putting out the message that the ethnic identity of white Americans is illegitimate, and that thinking of white people as a race is evil. No explanation why, though, something about it being vulgar and not trad. Auron is the last step of gatekeeping to stop white people taking their own side. Thankfully, this message is so stupid that only dullards and shills like Auron can maintain it, now that it has to compete in the public square with real nationalism. And underneath this post of Keith Woods, Nick Fuentes commented, "Great post," he said. No, Nick, it's not a great post, but I guess from his worldview it would be. Now, I had to stop myself there because there were many things that I felt were mischaracterizations or misunderstandings or outright bad faith statements of Keith. But let's back up here. Not all of the interview we have to listen to. A few sections early on will be relevant.
Well, I don't think we have ancestors as a nation, right? I mean, what percentage of the population has an ancestor who fought in the Civil War?
Yeah, increasingly very few. And that's actually a huge problem as we face these issues coming with deportations. A lot of people are asking, okay, we understand mass deportations for illegals. We get that. But what about legal immigrants? How does that work? Who is an American ultimately, right? And that's really going to be the question of our age. We're transitioning from a moment where identity globally was very ideological, right? You're either communist or you're capitalist. You're with one empire or another, you're first world or second world. That was shattered, right? That paradigm was shattered after the end of the Cold War. And instead, we all had to turn back inward and stop having this global ideological struggle and ask, okay, now that that's gone, who are we as peoples again? And that struggle to understand national identity, I think, is seeping through everything, including our ability to understand our own traditions and understand how our constitution work and what our values actually are, not just what's being handed to us by the news media or an educational system.
And Auron says that during the Cold War, the question of American identity was ideological. To be American meant to believe in freedom, democracy, and I suppose to an extent capitalism, but maybe not all Americans would have agreed with that, but that was the prevailing ideology. But he says today, ideology fails to give us a complete identity. It has failed.
So we're understanding ourselves in a very different way. And where does that shake out? Like, what is identity post ideology?
Well, the most traditional understanding of identity is a collection of many different factors, including language, religion, people, place, heritage, tradition, folkways, history. These things were all the different aspects that made up human society until we needed to create these supranational organizations run by managerial elites that didn't have any connection to these individual places. And that's why we see over and over again our different world governments desperately trying to erode the particular nature of peoples. If you look at the UK right now, they're completely destroying any free speech tradition. They're completely destroying any Anglo understanding of rights. And they're all doing it in the name of creating this multicultural society that England never had in the first place. And so you see these elites who are destroying the nature and quality of their people. They're actively replacing the people in their nation, because if they do that, then those barriers to the power that previously existed that were tied to the tradition will be gone.
Now, around 1338 into the interview is the part which I think Keith Woods really objected to. This is where Auron says that we have a modern, vulgar use of the concept of race.
I can imagine a multiracial society. I certainly want to. I don't understand what a multicultural society is. How can you have a multicultural society? Because society is culture. So, like, how can many exist in one society?
Well, and this is, I think, a real problem with our really modern and vulgar use of race. Race is a macro category. Ethnos is a more organic micro category, right? And so when we think about different ethnicities in Europe, there are many, right? The difference between an Italian and a Swede is rather large. However, there's this
vast,
right? It's huge,
vast,
right? But there's this macro category of white or European, and that means something, but it really only means things in a highly racialized society. So it used to be that in America we had Black Americans, and they had a specific ethnic identity because they had basically been shorn of their previous ethnic identity. They didn't have a connection to their tribe, to their peoples, to their history. And so they had an ethnogenesis. They formed an ethnos in the United States.
Blacks were uprooted from their local particular tribes in Africa, and they were mixed together with blacks from all over West Africa in America. So for this reason, they developed a collective black racial identity early on in America's history, but it took longer for this to happen with whites.
But the white population, the European descendants, were ones that had different European ethnos backgrounds. They had Germanic backgrounds, they had English backgrounds, Irish, all these, right? And so those different identities were distinct, and we even had different neighborhoods, entire states that were settled by very different peoples, even though they're of European descent. But as we have racialized, as we have become only interested in those macro categories, all of those separate white ethnoses that once existed have been pulled into
or separate
the singular
black,
identity.
for that matter.
Right, yeah, the ones that existed previously.
The Scots and the Irish and the English held on to their traditions and ways of life from the home countries. They did so longer. But it's not to say that there wasn't any ethnogenesis. They did eventually blend together to varying degrees into one American culture, but it was one primarily informed by Anglo-Protestant culture. Yes, it was white. No one would deny that the white race was a factor of American identity historically, but that white European conglomerate was informed by an Anglo-Protestant tradition. And this was the cultural framework to which later Europeans assimilated with varying degrees of success, generally successfully. So this is one of Keith's objections. He doesn't think it's fair that Auron is recognizing that the blacks get to have a collective identity. It's legitimate, it's a historical fact. But whites, well, you guys don't have a collective identity. I mean, I could see how this would be disliked by some nationalists. But let's keep in mind, Auron is not denying that the white race is still there. He's just saying there's more to it than that. And after everything, he's right. Auron is just historically correct. You might not like it, but he's not wrong. We didn't have a white collective identity until the 20th century to some extent. And even then, not in the way that other groups do. Now, what Auron mentions about how you lose connection with your former traditions and customs, and then you develop a racial consciousness in place of it, is something mirrored by E. Michael Jones. Again, I don't agree with everything E. Michael Jones has said, but he had a similar comment regarding the rise of white identity in the 20th century. Whites were centered in many urban neighborhoods throughout the United States, and due to the government working in concert with corporations, they were invaded by projects with blacks that were brought in through purposeful institutional directives to disrupt these local communities, where they now escape to the suburbs, having lost their old neighborhoods and ways of living, easily assimilated into a white identity. And maybe that's not even necessarily a bad thing. It's not always a bad thing to obviously adapt to new circumstances. But the new divide at that time became the difference between the black inner cities and the white suburbs. That was not the American experience for most of American history. That doesn't mean that European peoples didn't recognize that they were more similar and more related than they were to Africans or Arabs, but they placed their local identities higher in their daily life. It held more meaning for them than a generic white identity. That doesn't mean that the white race isn't a real biological category. Of course, I include more than just biology and race. I think it does include culture and is essentially a metaphysical spirit, but there's always a biological component. No one would ever deny that. I don't think Auron MacIntyre is denying that. If you say, well, that's making the white identity illegitimate to point this out, it's not saying that it's necessarily illegitimate. It's just pointing out a historical fact that it didn't really exist. He's not saying don't try to build this. By all means, go try to build this identity. Try to build your white racialized society just on race alone. You're not going to give any serious consideration to culture, to religion. It'll just be white. You could try to make it legitimate. It probably won't work, I think he would surmise. I don't think it would work. And it hasn't worked historically. That's what he's saying. That doesn't mean that white people aren't a people who can survive. It just means that there's more to our identity than merely being white.
Yeah. Washington, D.C. is I think the largest population of Ethiopians and Eritreans who are black. Ask them what they think of local black people.
Right.
Right. I don't know that they've anything in common. They don't seem to. Right. So, but why would you want to erase all of those very real differences? Like why pretend that Swedes are the same as Sicilians?
Because eventually each one of those particular cultures creates a high level of resistance to both standardization and scale of managerial power, but most importantly, to government power. Because peoples with particular traditions and identities aren't going to just go along with whatever the government says. They have real, organic, deeply seated understandings of who they are. We can just look at COVID, right? Who are all the people that actually resisted during COVID?
Orthodox Jews, the Amish.
The religious, people with high degrees of individual transcendent identities, right?
Yeah.
This is my group, my practice of my religion, the people I go to church with, the people in my community, they are more important than whatever the state believes. And the only thing that can push back against that, it's not abstract principle. It's not words in a constitution. The words in the constitution only restrict the government if they reflect particular understandings of peoples and the way that they live their lives. And that's why those communities were more resilient, because even if there was no paper constitution to protect them, their real beliefs, their real identity actually resisted the state.
So Auron mentions that during COVID, local, strong communities like the Orthodox Jews, like the Amish, were more successful in resisting these draconian government policies than were the population at large. And the reason they were able to resist was that they had a strong community. They had a strong, deep-rooted identity. The word of people in their community mattered more to them than what the television or the newspaper or some government officials were saying. What did Keith Woods do with this? He assumed that Auron was saying that we need to see more Orthodox Jewish communities in America, more Amish communities in America, and have hundreds of various white communities which are not united, but they're this fragmented ethnos of different small communities. Do you really think that's what Auron was saying? I can only imagine that's bad faith. I don't think Keith Woods is that stupid. I think he knows what Auron was trying to say. He's not trying to say that we need to have America splintered. If anything, he argues for unity. But these communities are showing us something that works, that we need for our people. If you want to have a unified people, then at least follow their example. It doesn't follow that therefore you're going to splinter into 1,000 different small ethno communities. But there's things that those small ethno communities do that we can do to protect our people and ensure the flourishing of our people. We need strong communal bonds. That starts with a family. That starts with being involved in a local church. So after about 17 minutes, the topic of the interview changes to managerialism, the growth of managerialism, how managerialism seeks to perpetuate itself. But around 25, 26 minutes in, it gets interesting again. The question is raised, what is a heritage American?
The large amount of our government right now is just a wealth transfer between heritage Americans and the new political class that's being moved into rule society. That's just the dynamic we're seeing. And this happened in Rome. This has happened many, many times over. You can see many historical examples.
So the H-1B thing is just so the enemy is what you call heritage Americans. What are those?
Heritage Americans are those that are actually tied. You could find their last names in the Civil War registry. Like they have a tie to the history and to the land. And, Samuel Huntington is a guy who I really like. He wrote the Clash of Civilizations and Who Are We? And, I think won his debate with Francis Fukuyama pretty decisively. But, he said in Who Are We, his book about American identity, the core of American identity is the Anglo-Protestant spirit. And he's a man of the center left, as a Harvard professor. This is a guy who's not, he's not, you can only be an Anglo or a Protestant to be part of America. But he says even the Catholics and Jews in America take on this Anglo-Protestant affect in some way.
So not all of those who became heritage Americans were fully 100% descended from someone in England or Ireland, or although the majority of them probably were. But that became the dominant framework, both probably genetically and culturally, that you assimilated. Because if you marry into a culture, you probably end up breeding with someone who has more of the Anglo or Scottish genetics. But more importantly, you're going to absorb that culture, those values, those ways of living and seeing the world, the work ethic,
What exactly are the presuppositions? What's the nature of this Anglo-Protestant culture that founded this country?
I think this is where people get a lot of the ideas of a decent amount of individualism. This has always been a key part of it. Also, restrained government, the idea that government would be limited is something tied to the Magna Carta, right? Like, yes, they had became a constitutional monarchy, but we can see a direct line from what the English were doing with their set of government and the way that we understand our society. The idea that free speech is something sacred, that the individual conscience and the practice of religion is something that needs to be maintained. These are all core values that when you actually look in other societies, they don't look the same. Free speech in Germany does not look the same.
There's no Slavic society, and I love Slavic societies, just being honest. They're great, but they don't see free speech as a foundational God-given right. They just don't.
Right. And
they're whiter than I am. So it's not, it is like, it's much, that is to your very smart point about lumping all these different, very distinct cultures into the white group eliminates differences that we should be thinking about. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Even inside European cultures, vastly different traditions, closer perhaps than say someone in Eastern Asia, but still very, very different from place to place. And the fact that we've just kind of melted that all down into this, binary or between a couple of few races, as if that's like the complete understanding of who peoples are and how they live their lives, is just silly. And again, I think that serves the purpose of really just melting down culture in general, right? Like, it looks like race is very divisive identity politics, right? Which to some degree it is. But the reason it feels so divisive, the reason it feels so unnatural, is it's thoroughly unrooted from actual organic ways of being. It's completely removed from the things that make your life better when you have a holistic identity. It's just this rough collection of hatred for people who happen to have a different skin color.
Auron MacIntyre on Tucker Carlson is a good thing. This means that what he's saying is getting more of a wider audience. That's not something to be upset about, to think that this is all gatekeeping. I certainly don't think Auron MacIntyre is a gatekeeper. And I don't have any big problem with Tucker Carlson either. That doesn't mean we have to trust 100% of what Tucker Carlson says. I don't really care much about his spat with Nick Fuentes. But I think Auron and Tucker are doing good work. Even Nick Fuentes is doing good work. Hasta luego, amigos.